I'd like to introduce now Jayne Triber, who is an author and historian. I know many of you are very familiar with her. And her lecture tonight will be Defending the City, Defending the Nation, the Military History of the Boston Harbor Islands. And I just want to point out also that Jayne will be working with the Friends of the Harbor Islands this summer and giving tours of the harbor. So you should definitely talk to her after the lecture about this. And at the conclusion of Jayne's lecture this evening, we have a question and answer microphone. So if you have any questions, we'll ask you to please approach the microphone so that you can be heard by everyone in the hall. I'd like to now introduce Jayne Triber. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very nice to see all of you tonight. Actually, I can't see you because I just took my glasses off, but I know you're out there. I can hear you breathing. I'd like to thank a couple of people, a couple of my colleagues from the Boston Harbor Islands National Park. Suzanne Gallmarsh very nicely brought the display here behind me. If any of you haven't seen it, do come up afterwards. Gives you a nice overview of the military history of the Harbor Islands in pictures. And I'd also like to thank another colleague, Chris Benedetto, who's sitting over here. Last summer, Chris and I developed a tour of the military history of the Harbor Islands. So that's when I first started putting this together. Also, I had worked at Fort Independence in the summer of 1984 and did my master's thesis on the fort. So I keep returning to the subject of military history, even though technically I don't consider myself a military historian. I'm really an early Americanist. Now, you know, the story of the military history of the Boston Harbor Islands is a long story. It extends over 3 centuries, from the colonial wars through the Cold War. And I was thinking as I was working on this, God, that's an awful lot of war. So I thought in the interest of time we might take a vote and see which war you'd like me to skip tonight. So, okay, I guess I'll do them all then. You asked for it. Our story begins very shortly after the arrival of the Puritans in Massachusetts in 1630. Governor John Winthrop and about 1,000 settlers arrived here with the goal of establishing a model Christian community in the New World. They also established an outpost of the British Empire in the New World. They were thousands of miles away from their mother country, which actually was probably a good thing since they had political and religious disagreements with their government. The question of harbor defense was going to be largely up to Massachusetts. And there really was a threat of invasion because for much of the 17th century, those of us who studied English history recall that England was at war with the Netherlands and France. So there was a possibility that Massachusetts could be invaded. So within 2 years, the government of Massachusetts set about to defend Boston, their city on a hill. It was a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water and entered by a very narrow shipping channel. And you might want to take a look at the 18th century map that we have set up behind me to see that. In 1632, the government of Massachusetts built Fort Hill, a gun battery, which was leveled in 1872. But if you're looking for it today, it's on High Street in the Financial District, and there's a really nice picture on one of the buildings there. But by February of 1633, they decided we need a defense further down in the harbor. So Governor Winthrop and his council went down to Nantasket. They took a little field trip, and they spent 2 nights there caught in a storm. So what seemed like a good idea at the time, they kind of changed their mind about building a fort at Nantasket. Then in 1634, the new governor, Thomas Dudley, and his council found a better site for fortifications. It was a small island located about 2.5 miles southeast of Boston, in what is South Boston today. It was known as Castle Island, and there they built the first fortification in Boston Harbor. It was completed in 1635 and known as the Castle. And Castle Island has the distinction of being the oldest continually fortified site in the United States. So we do have bragging rights about that. So if I were to mark the beginning of the military history of the Boston Harbor Islands, that's it. They built this simple little earthwork with 2 gun platforms, not the massive Fort Independence that you see today. And since that time, from the colonial wars from the colonial period through the Cold War, several of the islands have contained fortifications, gun batteries, prisoner of war camps, training camps, and believe it or not, even Nike missile installations in the 1950s. And I think there are several themes to be stressed here. What I came across in my research on this was a number of important political issues. First of all, the role of a professional military in a republic. Another issue was the impact of United States foreign policy on the local level. Through studying the Harbor Islands, we really get the true meaning of all of the various wars this country has experienced. Another issue is the relationship between the federal and state government over the control of the military, and that's a serious question throughout military history. And the fourth area that I really uncovered, I think, is what I would call the human side of war. Through looking at contemporary letters and journals and newspaper accounts, I got to experience what all these wars were like for real people. So that's some of what I'd like to share with you tonight. And if we return to the 17th century, I think one important point to keep in mind is that Massachusetts was not a royal colony. It was a private corporation. It had a charter from the Crown that gave it specific rights of self-government. So basically, their self-government and defense was the issue that was left up to Massachusetts until 1691, when their charter was revoked and they became yet another royal colony. And henceforth, the Crown would exert greater political control and military control over Massachusetts. And accordingly, in 1701, the Crown assigned William Wolfgang Romer, chief colonial engineer, and he built the first royal fortification at Castle Island. It was completed in 1703, and it was known as Castle William in honor of the king, William III. But despite that increased royal control, much of the responsibility for harbor defense was still up to Massachusetts. They repaired the fortifications or built new ones at Castle Island throughout the 17th century. In 1696, Massachusetts decided we need another defense. So they decided that they would build a gun battery opposite Castle Island on Governor's Island. So the theory was, should an enemy vessel invade Boston, she would be caught in the crossfire between the guns of Castle Island and the guns of Governor's Island. Now, if those of you are poring over a map and are scratching your head because you can't find Governor's Island, don't worry, you're not stupid. Well, you may be stupid, but it may have nothing to do with Governor's Island. Governor's Island actually was swallowed up when Logan Airport was expanded between 1943 and 1947. Apple, birds, and Governor's Island under a runway at Logan Airport. So think about that the next time you take a trip. Please don't ask which runway. I do not know. Call Massport. The Boston Harbor Islands, though, were not just the site of fortifications and gun batteries to protect Boston from foreign attack. The islands were also used in the 17th century as places to protect Massachusetts from the enemy within. And in 1675, the enemy within was perceived to be the Native American. Now, I know many of you were probably at the first lecture and heard a great deal about King Philip's War from the Native American point of view. What I did was read a lot of the material in the state archives, which kind of explains the thinking behind Massachusetts' action from the point of view of the government of Massachusetts. So it's kind of the other side of the story. King Philip, or Metacom, was the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem or Indian leader. He had been a friend to the Pilgrims from the time they established Plymouth in 1620 until his death in 1661. But by 1675, Metacom had determined that war was the only way to protect Indian land, culture, and independence from the continual encroachment of English colonists. In June of 1679, the Wampanoags, who were joined by the Pecasets, Nipmunks, and Narragansetts, began attacking the English settlements. By 1675, the upper Connecticut Valley was under attack. They came as close to Boston as Weymouth, 20 miles away, in 1676, and that's when panic really set in Boston and Winthrop. And gripped by this panic and paranoia, the people and government of Massachusetts turned against all Indians, including Christianized Indians who ironically had decided we're not going to fight against the English. A lot of good it did them. On October 13th, 1675, the Massachusetts Council ordered the removal of the so-called praying Indians of Natick to Deer Island, which of course today is the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority sewage treatment plant. They also evacuated other praying Indian towns. The council ordered Captain Daniel Henchman of Boston, quote, to see that none of the Indians may attempt to get off the island to the main, so that the people in those parts that are fearful of them may be quieted. I guess the people in Winthrop are getting just a little bit antsy about Native Americans. There's a very poignant description of the roundup of these Indians. It comes from Reverend John Eliot. He was the so-called apostle to the Indians. He had translated the Bible into the Massachusetts language, and he described the melancholy scene. He wrote, "When the Indians were hurried away to an island at half an hour's notice, poor souls in terror, they left their goods, books, and Bibles. In December of 1675, Elliot and Daniel Gookin, who was superintendent of Indians in Massachusetts, found about 500 starving Indian men and women on Deer Island. Gookin wrote, "The island was bleak and cold, their wigwams poor and mean, their clothes few and thin." And he seems to have been genuinely sympathetic towards the Native Americans, as I've read some of his accounts. The war was essentially over by the summer of 1676. King Philip had been killed in battle, and most of his followers began to surrender or escape westward. The Massachusetts Council ordered that the Indians at Deer Island should be turned loose at this point. But it was a little late. Statistics on casualties range from a low of 200 to a high of 3,000, but I think it's safe and conservative to say that probably more than half of the Native Americans interned there died due to the insufficient clothing and shelter and the poor conditions on the island. And for the past several years, every October, Native Americans return to Deer Island to mark that sad anniversary in the history of their ancestors. In contrast to the 17th century, I would describe the first half of the 18th century and the military history of the Harbor Islands as a relatively tranquil and quiet time. Do you sense a but is coming? Well, you're right. That all changed in the 1760s. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, they called it the American Revolution. You're getting a Cliff Notes version of American history, by the way, sort of a whirlwind tour of 4 centuries. The change came in 1763, and first it seemed like a good change. Great Britain had defeated France in the 7 Years' War. Colonists in Boston cheered that victory because, after all, they were English citizens. Well, they soon had cause to regret that. The cost of victory was enormously high, a massive war debt, and Parliament came up with what they thought was a brilliant plan to pay off the war debt. Say, why don't we tax our American colonies? It did seem like a good idea originally. What really got the colonists riled up, I think the act that really set them off, was the Stamp Act, which was passed on March 1st of 1765. It was a tax on legal papers and playing cards and a host of everyday items that people used. But it really wasn't so much the money that they paid that bothered them. Okay, of course they weren't thrilled about paying taxes. No one is. But the real issue was a constitutional issue. Never before had English colonists been asked to pay an internal tax unless it was imposed by their local assemblies, and the members of the assembly were people that they elected. To them, this was tyranny. This was unconstitutional. And in August of 1765, the patriots in Boston decided to protest quite directly. Well, I'm being kind. Actually, protest is a euphemism. It's more like a riot. It started out peacefully enough. They had a parade, burned effigies of officials that they believed were responsible for the Stamp Act. They leveled the building that they believed would be used as the stamp office. But then they took things a little bit too far, and about a week or so later, when they destroyed the home of Andrew Oliver, who would be the stamp master of Massachusetts, and his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. The governor, Francis Bernard, fled to Castle William, where he could be protected by the guns there, and he strengthened the defenses, awaiting a possible attack by the Sons of Liberty. So Castle William was transformed into something that had defended British liberty, and now it becomes a symbol of British tyranny. What happened was when the stamp paper arrived, it was lodged at Castle William for protection. And Boston printer John Boyle wrote in his journal, "The stamp paper is lodged at Castle William, but the inhabitants of this and the other governments are determined not to make use of it." In the fall of 1768, the British Crown dispatched 4 regiments to uphold law and order in Massachusetts, and they were quartered, many of them, at Castle William. And in fact, Castle William was turned over from Massachusetts to the British Army in 1770. During the protests over the Tea Act, the agents who had agreed to sell the taxed tea, again, not a very good idea, were forced to flee to Castle William to be protected by the British Army. The Boston Gazette reported their obstinacy made them infinitely more obnoxious to their countrymen than even the stamp masters were. Well, 10 years of protest in defense of colonial liberty ended very dramatically on April 19, 1775, in the battles of Lexington and Concord. The militia fought bravely and well, and the British Army fled back to Boston, where they spent the next 11 months holed up in what is called the Siege of Boston. They were surrounded by the Continental Army in Cambridge, Roxbury, Dorchester, and Brighton. They were joined by civilians. Paul Revere, for example, could not return to Boston because he probably would have been arrested by the British for his role in carrying the famous warning, which we know as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. He remained in Watertown with his family, but he left his teenage son in Boston to keep an eye on the property. So patriots who were too old, too sick, or too afraid to leave their property behind stayed in Boston. Meanwhile, the Tories, or those loyal to the British government, fled from the countryside into Boston so they could be protected by the British Army. For the next 11 months, they remained holed up. There were no major battles except for the Battle of Bunker Hill, but the Boston Harbor Islands nonetheless had an important role to play. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, sheep and cattle were grazed on the Boston Harbor Islands, and now they became a source of food for the British Army. Well, the government of Massachusetts knew that, and they ordered that the livestock should be stripped from the harbor islands. And that set off a number of skirmishes between the Continental Army and mass militia and the British Army. There were raids of cattle on Pettick's Island, Deer Island, and Long Island in the spring and summer of 1775. But the most famous confrontation of all between British and American forces, at least the only one that earned the title of battle, was the Battle of Grape Island. Yes, the famous Battle of Grape Island on May 21st, 1775. Is there anyone here who has not heard of the Battle of Grape Island? Okay, some of you may have been absent that day when it was taught in school. So let us return to the glorious days of yesteryear. Our narrator is Boston printer John Boyle, who fled with his family to Hingham soon after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was Sunday morning, May 21st, 1775. At 7 a.m., Boyle wrote, "The town was alarmed by the ringing of the meeting-house bell and the drums beating to arms. What was the cause of this excitement? Well, British soldiers were spotted on Grape Island. They were carrying hay from the barn of Loyalist Elisha Leavitt. Well, the brave citizens of Hingham, Weymouth, and other South Shore towns sprang into action, ready to save that country on that morning. They leaped into their boats, but there was one tiny little problem. It was called low tide. Alas, they could not go over to Grape Island until 4 in the afternoon, but so they did. Boyle continues, our people landed and set fire to the barn, which together with about 70 tons of hay was entirely consumed. They did an important task that day, all kidding aside. They deprived the British Army of hay for its horses. And best of all, Boyle was happy to report a great number of guns were discharged on both sides, but the distance being so great, 'tis thought no person was hurt. And I think, as a pacifist, that's the best battle of all. No one was hurt. Now, there was another way that the British could get supplied, and that is by water. So the Continental Army decided we shall try to destroy the lighthouse on Little Brewster Island, which had been guiding ships into Boston Harbor since 1716. They made 2 attempts in the summer of 1775. They succeeded in burning the interior of the lighthouse, and they also did some damage to other buildings on the grounds, but the British managed to chase them off both times. Still, the efforts of the Continental Army and mass militia to strip the harbor islands of livestock were taking their toll on the approximately 6,500 inhabitants of Boston that were trapped there in the summer of 1775. And we get a very vivid picture of conditions from Boston Selectman Timothy Newell. He wrote in his diary on August 1st, 1775, "This day was invited by 2 gentlemen to dine upon rats." I like to tell that story on my Lunchtime Cruises. It always seems to go over so well. Yes, I'm sort of aiming, my audience is really 8th grade boys. It's kind of a gross-out tour. So I invite you all to join me this summer. Boston was finally delivered from captivity on March 17, 1776, when the British Army evacuated Boston. To their astonishment, the Continental Army had erected temporary fortifications at Dorchester Heights on March 5th. They planned to storm the heights, but a violent storm prevented them, and they evacuated Boston on March 17th, a date which we all celebrate every year. Of course, many of you have been erroneously celebrating St. Patrick's Day, so I just wanted to point that out. The British Army left along with several Tories, but the British fleet remained in Nantasket, hanging out for the next couple of months, so there was a threat of reinvasion. General George Washington and most of the Continental Army left for New York on April 4th, and they left the issue of harbor defense pretty much up to the government of Massachusetts with 5 Continental regiments to help them out. The Massachusetts government sprang into action on April 23rd. They appointed Colonel Josiah Whitney and a company to repair and build new fortifications at Castle William. And one of the people who helped him was Major Paul Revere. The Massachusetts General Court also appointed a committee on harbor defense, and they had several recommendations. They suggested that they should reduce the depth of water in the Narrows, which is the ship channel that runs between Lovell's and Gallops and George's Island. They recommended sinking hulks of vessels there to prevent the British from reinvading, and they also recommended fortifying Long Island, Moon Island, Peddocks Island, and General Artemus Ward, who was the Continental Army officer in charge of the regiments, also said we should garrison or we should put fortifications on George's Island. Unfortunately, all they did was pretty much talk. John Adams, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, was absolutely exasperated by the slow progress in defending Boston Harbor. He kept getting updates from his friend James Warren, a political leader in Massachusetts. And on May 8th, Warren wrote, "We do all we can with little or no assistance from the continent. Is not Boston in this colony of as much consequence as New York?" Funny, that's what Red Sox fans ask every year. Adams, yes, I thought I'd work a little baseball humor in there. Adams even wrote to his wife, Abigail. He thought that she might use her influence to get the ladies to influence their husbands to fortify upon George's Island, Lovell's, Peddocks, Long, or whatever. And this would not be the last time that Massachusetts political leaders complained that the national government was leaving them defenseless. Finally, on June 11th, Massachusetts took action to drive the British fleet from Nantasket. They managed to land a detachment on Long Island and built works and fired on the British on June 14th, driving them from Boston Harbor forever. But the British got their revenge. They blew up the lighthouse on Little Brewster Island before they left. Fortunately, Massachusetts was pretty much out of the war by then. There wasn't a whole lot of excitement. The French arrived as our allies in 1778, and finally they did something about Boston Harbor defense. They built an earthwork on George's Island, and they also built a gun battery at Hull. And the French fleet also provided a little bit of revolutionary excitement in late 1782. The French fleet sailed into Boston Harbor with their magnificent vessels, including the Magnifique. And they soon proved how treacherous it was to navigate through the Narrows, because the Magnifique ran aground on Lovell's Island. With the coming of peace, the United States had a number of decisions to make, and one of them was what kind of foreign policy would we have, what sort of military we would have. Well, under George Washington, the decision was that we should try to maintain friendly relations, commercial relations with all European nations, and we should stay the heck out of their political disputes. Well, it proved easier said than done. In 1793, our wartime ally, France, went to war against Great Britain, and the United States would get caught in the retaliatory trade restrictions. The Washington administration responded by proposing the creation of a navy, a new system of harbor defense, and it would be manned by the newly created Peacetime Army. This so-called first system of fortifications was built between 1794 and 1804. The Secretary of War chose the engineers, who were usually French. They were pretty much the leaders in harbor defense. He supplied general instructions, but the state governments were allowed to confer with the military engineers in choosing sites and plans. And this was a carryover from the Revolution, this fear of a strong central government. In May of 1794, Secretary of War Henry Knox appointed Stephen Rochefontaine. He was a French engineer who had fought at Yorktown, and he was to supervise construction of new fortifications in New England. And what he hoped was that Massachusetts would give up control of Castle Island to the United States. Well, unfortunately, Governor Samuel Adams and the Massachusetts legislature did not agree. What they feared was the presence of a professional army at Castle Island, where they would not be under the control of the local government, but the national government. So Massachusetts voted no. 4 years later, in 1798, though, they did an abrupt about-turn. Circumstances had changed. By 1798, the United States was involved with an undeclared naval war with France. War hysteria swept the country. And here in Massachusetts, they very much supported their president, John Adams, who was a local boy, but also a Federalist. So they felt very confident turning over Castle Island to the hands of President John Adams. So on October 2nd, 1798, Massachusetts ended 164 years of colonial and state sovereignty and turned over Castle Island to the United States. In 1803, the United States government completed the first federal fortification at Castle Island. In the meantime, President Adams had voted to rename Castle William Fort Independence, and that became the name of the new fort, completed in 1803 by Colonel Jean Fontaine. By this time, however, politics had changed. Castle Island was no longer under the control of the Federalist John Adams, but the Republican Thomas Jefferson, which absolutely horrified Massachusetts Federalists, including Paul Revere, who wrote to his Congressman Harrison Gray Otis, "What a dreadful change in politics." And so it was in the eyes of Massachusetts Federalists. Throughout the Jefferson and Madison administration, Massachusetts Federalists felt increasingly estranged, alienated, whatever word you want to use, from their government. They felt that the new western states were much more important, and that was even more so with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the United States. As war between Great Britain and France continued, Massachusetts Federalists really opposed the solutions that the Jefferson and Madison administration came up with. In 1807, the British frigate HMS Leopard opened fire on the USS Chesapeake off Norfolk, Virginia. They were trying to impress or forcibly remove what they believed were deserters from the British Navy, but in the process they killed 3 Americans and wounded 18. Congress responded in December of 1807 with a new system of harbor defense, and Jefferson came up with an alternative to war, an embargo, forbidding the export of American commerce to any foreign ports. The Army Corps of Engineers assigned Major Joseph Gardner Swift to New England as part of what was known as the Second System of Fortifications, a plan of harbor defense carried out from 1807 to 1816. It was the first construction effort carried out exclusively by American engineers, but other than that, there wasn't much change in architecture or armament from the first system. Well, Swift had recommendations. He said that any new system of harbor defense should include fortifications on George's Island and Long Island, because the outer harbor was strategically more important than the inner harbor. What did the War Department do? They ignored him. They recommended just building a new fort on Governor's Island in the inner harbor. He also recommended that the forts should be designed on the spot so they would be suitable to the local topography. The War Department said, "Nope, here's a plan, make it work." So Swift did the best he could. He built a new fortification that was completed in 1808, and it was named Fort Warren after the Revolutionary War hero Joseph Warren. Not to be confused with the present Fort Warren on George's Island. That fort was built later, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Now, 2 years after this fort on Governor's Island was completed, the Republican Party returned to its original principles of limited government, reducing the Army and Navy, and abolishing internal taxes. The result was a nation completely unprepared for war when it came in June of 1812. When the United States declared war against Great Britain over the issues of impressment and violations of neutral trade, Massachusetts Federalists vehemently opposed what they always called Mr. Madison's War. Their thinking was, France is just as guilty as England of violating our trade. Why don't we go to war against France? Well, Governor Caleb Strong, a Federalist, even refused to turn over the Massachusetts militia to the federal government, because under the Constitution, the grounds for detaching the federal militia were to put down an internal rebellion or to prevent a foreign invasion. And he said those conditions don't exist. Why are we going to go to war against England, the nation from which we are descended and which for many generations has the bulwark of the religion we profess? They didn't want to go to war against, as they called it, our unoffending neighbors in Canada. So Massachusetts wouldn't turn over the militia to the United States government. Now, they charged that Massachusetts was left defenseless by the federal government, and it's not a baseless charge. In 1809, Secretary of War William Eustis delivered a report to the House of Representatives, and he said that Fort Independence was calculated for 50 guns with 2 batteries to contain 25 guns. 2 years later, Fort Independence had 42 guns, not 50, and the 2 batteries with 25 guns, they only had 6 guns there. There were supposed to be 624 artillerists to garrison the fort. At no time during the War of 1812 were there ever more than 200 artillerists, and most time there were between 65 and 75. So Massachusetts wasn't entirely off base in claiming the federal government was leaving them defenseless. 2 years later, the situation became critical in the summer of 1814 when the British blockaded the New England coast and began raiding coastal towns. Now Massachusetts changed his mind and said, okay, you can have the militia. But they still didn't quite trust the government. What they feared was that the troops that they would send to Fort Independence would not be used to protect Massachusetts from invasion, but to retake Maine from the British or invade Canada. So Massachusetts says, well, we better take care of ourselves. They appointed their own engineer, Colonel Loami Baldwin of Woburn, and he used militia units and volunteers to repair, strengthen, and construct fortifications and gun batteries on the harbor islands. One of the volunteers who offered to help Colonel Baldwin was the nearly 80-year-old Paul Revere. Took his shovel and went out to Nautils Island, which is now East Boston, and helped build Fort Strong. Colonel Baldwin also built new works on Castle Island and Governor's Island. Luckily for Massachusetts, the War of 1812 was over in January in 1815, so they didn't have to worry about an invasion. But the war had taught them something. It revealed several military weaknesses, and the United States reorganized the Army, Navy, and War Department. From 1816 to 66, they carried out the third system of harbor fortifications. The previous systems were sort of emergency measures responding to specific actions. This was the first peacetime effort over a 50-year period to create a permanent, integrated system of harbor defense. A special board of officers reviewed site selections, designs, and the engineers' plans. And from 1833 to 1857, Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, the former superintendent of West Point, supervised the construction of 3 fortifications on the Boston Harbor Islands. By 1851, the new Fort Independence, a 5-sided masonry fort, was ready to be garrisoned. By 1860, its sister fort on George's Island, which got the name Fort Warren, was largely finished, but its armament wasn't even complete. The third fort was begun on Governor's Island in 1846 to replace the old Fort Warren, whose name was transferred to George's Island. The new fort was named Fort Winthrop, but it wasn't even finished by the time the Civil War broke out. By the time the war broke out, Boston Harbor was not in a good condition. On April 15, 1861, 3 days after the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 3-month volunteers, and Massachusetts was to supply 20 companies. Governor John Andrew, who actually was a first-term governor, wrote to the commanding officer of the Department of the East in the Army, basically giving him an appraisal of the conditions of the Harbor Island forts. He wrote that he had garrisoned Fort Independence on Castle Island with 150 men, and they were infantrymen, not artillerists. He also said he could send a similar number of men to George's Island and a 3rd Battalion at Fort Winthrop, and he had 2,000 to 3,000 volunteers, and he hoped to place them under drill at the fort. But here was the problem. In Fort Independence, he wrote, there are none of the casemate guns mounted and no barbette guns on the face which vessels entering the harbor approach. The casemate guns are the guns in the vault that's created between the inner and outer wall of the fort, and the barbette guns were up on the higher level. So essentially the fort was defenseless. Forts Warren and Winthrop were even worse shape. They didn't have any guns at all. Throughout the war, for the next 4 years, Governor Andrew would constantly petition the federal government for more help on harbor defense and essentially received very little help. His letters, by the way, are in the state archives, and it's an exercise in futility to read his letters. On April of 1863, Massachusetts appropriated $1 million for coast defenses, and also Governor Andrew sent his own agents to England to buy ordnance. All of the foundries in the United States were so busy turning out weaponry for the Union Army and the Navy that they couldn't supply Massachusetts. So the Army told Andrew, okay, send your own guys to England. He did. They bought guns, and then when they tried to bring them back in, the Ordnance Department said, no, because they don't match the caliber of the United States Army ordnance. So, and yes, some of us, I think, have probably dealt with the military before. An exasperated Governor Andrew wrote to Congressman Samuel Hooper on January 5, 1864. He agreed. Now, uniformity of caliber is convenient because it prevents the necessity of varieties of ammunition, but it is more convenient to repel invaders, even if you are obliged to use 2 kinds of shot and shell to do it. And his letters are really kind of fun to read. The Harbor Islands served a number of purposes during the Civil War. Because of the endless demand for troops, after all, by 1863, the North had resorted to a draft. So the Harbor Islands served primarily as recruiting and training camps. Fort Independence in the first month of the war was garrisoned by the New England Guards. These were basically elite, Harvard-educated sons of Boston and Cambridge gentry. One of them was Charles Francis Adams, son of the United States Ambassador to Great Britain, grandson of President John Quincy Adams, and great-grandson of John Adams. Yes, those Adamses. And he wrote to his mother describing military life in stark contrast to life as an Adams. He wrote to Mummy, the truth is that in garrison life, with guard duty 3 times in 2 weeks, 5 hours drill a day, and the necessity of waiting on oneself, it is difficult either to write or read much in a room about the size of our bedroom in Boston, in which 11 other men are quartered, that is, live, eat, and sleep besides myself. Yet I like the military life very much, and am getting rugged and hardy as an ox, passing all my time in eating, drilling, sleeping, and chaffing, which means teasing in a good-natured manner. So even though they simply couldn't get good help there, he still liked military life very much. Hope there's no Adams descendants out there. During the Civil War, Fort Independence was very busy with a wide range of military duties. Besides being a training camp, it was a prison for federal troops, and it was an ordnance testing post. Gallup's Island was a training camp and a mustering out camp for returning soldiers. And I think it's safe to say that the most famous regiment that was discharged from Gallup's was the 54th Regiment, the famous African-American regiment whose exploits were the subject of the film Glory. Long Island was a training camp, and it was primarily a training camp for draftees, some of whom were not entirely thrilled to be drafted into the military. There were about 1,500 draftees on the island in August of 1863, and the Boston Post reported 2 of them escaped through the connivance of friends who furnished them with citizens' clothes secreted upon their own persons. But of all of the harbor islands, I would say that George's Island was the busiest during the Civil War. Its strategic location, guarding the narrow shipping channel to the north and the Nantasket Road channel to the south, made it the most important from a point of view of harbor defense. It was also a recruiting and training camp, but its most important duty was as a Confederate prisoner of war camp. It housed both political and military prisoners. Among their prisoners were the Confederate diplomats James Murray Mason and John Slidell, who were arrested by the Union Navy on their way to Great Britain and France, trying to seek diplomatic recognition from the Confederacy. There was also one very daring escape from Fort Warren in August of 1863. It was led by a Captain Joseph W. Alexander, along with 2 other lieutenants, a political prisoner, and a couple of sailors. Alexander had discovered a way out of the fort. He discovered if he took off his clothes, he was just able to wriggle out through the musket loopholes in the basement of the fort. They were 6 feet high, 2 or 3 feet wide on the inside of the wall, and a little over 7 inches on the outside. So clearly only skinny guys could escape from Fort Warren. Well, they tried their daring escape on August 18th. The original plan was the sailors were to swim across from George's to Lovell's, steal a boat, and the other guys were to swim out to meet them. The sailors set off, but they were never seen again. We don't know what happened to them. Plan B, Alexander and Lieutenant Thurston were to float over on Lovell's Island using a framework that was used for target practice, and then they would come back for the other 2 men. One of the sentinels, however, noticed the target was missing, and he thought he saw something in the water. And Captain Alexander described what happened next. The guard lowered his musket into the water until the bayonet rested on Lieutenant Thurston's chest. The astonished Captain Alexander recalled, "He never moved a muscle, but remained perfectly quiet. That was the bravest thing I saw during the 4 years of the war." Well, Alexander and Thurston got over to Lovell's, stole a fishing boat, and made it as far as the coast of Maine, where they were stopped by a revenue cutter on August 20th. And they almost got away until somebody suggested, we should search these guys. And then they found Confederate money on one of them. So the jig was up. But the highest ranking prisoner of all at Fort Warren was Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. He was held at the fort from May 25th to October 13th, 1865. His only companions in the cell, he wrote, were a little mouse who eyed me from his hole and bedbugs, which he reluctantly killed. And he wrote of the bedbugs in his diary, "Most willingly would I turn them loose and let them go away, if they would go and stay. But this they will not do. Between them and me there is an irrepressible conflict. Either I or they must be extinguished." For those who are not Civil War buffs, he's being quite cute here. Irrepressible conflict is a phrase used by William Seward, and it refers to the irrepressible conflict between the North and South over slavery. So Stephens being a little tongue-in-cheek here. Despite the obvious deprivations of his confinement, conditions at Fort Warren were actually quite good. Of the 1,000 prisoners who passed through there during the Civil War, there were only 12 deaths. After the Civil War, there was a rethinking of harbor defense. Improvements in artillery basically made the inner harbor forts, Fort Independence and Fort Winthrop, obsolete, and it was going to become much more important to fortify the outer harbor islands. George's Island would be much more important, and so would Long Island. So in 1867, the United States acquired title to Long Island, and in 1871 began building new defenses there, which they called Fort Strong. In 1879, Fort Independence was actually decommissioned, and by the 1890s, Castle Island was a park. A decade later, so too was Governor's Island. By 1885, the United States set out to establish another system of harbor defense. It was called the Endicott Board, named for Secretary of War William C. Endicott. He convened a group of Army and Navy officers and civilians, and they came up with a $127 million very ambitious program. They recommended new defenses, a whole array of new weapons, torpedo boats, and submarine mines. In fact, under the Endicott system, new gun batteries were installed at George's Island in the 1890s. But not much was really done until the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War set off a sort of crash program of harbor defense in 1898, including the mining of Boston Harbor. The 1st Massachusetts Artillery was ordered into service at Fort Warren in May, and Castle Island returned to active service as a submarine mine station. Fortunately, the splendid little war, as Secretary of State John Hay called it, was over very quickly. But the United States emerged as an empire. Under that war, we acquired Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And in order to protect that empire, we would have to have a system of harbor defense and naval construction. And under the Endicott system, new batteries were constructed on Lovell's Island in 1900, which was then designated as Fort Standish, and on Peddocks Island in 1904, designated as Fort Andrews. To defend the harbor at the north, new defenses were built at Fort Banks and Heath and Winthrop, and at Fort Revere on Nantastic Head and Hull. In 1905, President Roosevelt convened another board under Secretary of War William Howard Taft, and they updated the Endicott system. They recommended the installation of 60-inch searchlights at several of the harbor forts. In fact, at the National Archives branch in Waltham, I spent a delightful hour reading an entire file that was just about searchlights. If anyone would like to read my notes, you're welcome to. It's very fascinating reading. But by the time World War I came around, Boston Harbor actually was not in a great condition of harbor defense. Improvements in naval weaponry and tactics basically made the harbor islands outdated. And during the World War I, the harbor defenses really did not serve so much as harbor defenses, but as training camps for the U.S. coastal artillery. The harbor was very busy. The harbor itself was mined, and troops were stationed at Fort Warren on George's Island. They were also at Fort Standish on Lovell's, Fort Strong on Long Island, Fort Andrews on Peddocks, as well as Fort Revere in Hull and Fort Banks in Winthrop. Fort Independence returned once again to active duty as an observation and identification station. It was manned by the Army and the Navy, and the United States also used Bumpkin Island down in Hingham as a training facility. The soldiers were kept busy drilling, planting mines, and a variety of other military duties, but they did have time for leisure activities, including baseball. I found a memo from Fort Standish dated May 15, 1918, and it stated that enlisted men on the baseball team were excused from guard duty on Saturdays. So even the baseball did not stop for war. After the war, the Army would have to incorporate the lessons they learned from World War I to prepare the United States for future wars, and that's what they did throughout the 20s and 30s. The major change was World War I had revealed the importance of aircraft. During World War I, in fact, anti-aircraft emplacements were mounted at Fort Independence, but the war ended before they actually mounted the guns. All that would change in World War II. The harbor defenses for this war would have to be able to withstand a direct hit from an aerial bomb or from battleship projectiles. So the Army Corps of Engineers designed a new generation of defenses for the Boston Harbor Islands. They protected the guns by reinforced concrete, steel, or earth, and the gun barrel would just project out covered by an armored shield. They also installed heavier weapons on several of the harbor island forts. And during the war, the Boston Harbor Islands were alive with military activity. Fort Banks in Winthrop was the headquarters for Boston Harbor Defense, and the coastal artillery was stationed at Fort Heath in Winthrop, Fort Warren at George's, Fort Strong at Long Island, Fort Standish on Lovell's, Fort Andrews on Peddocks, and Fort Revere in Hull. They also added new harbor defenses since World War I. Fort Ruckman in Nahant was built in the 20s, and Fort Duval on Hog Island. Hog Island, by the way, is now Spinnaker Island. Once they changed the name, unfortunately, everybody's real estate taxes probably went up 20%. Once the war began, harbor defense was also strengthened by the East Point Reservation in Nahant to the north and Fort Dawes on Deer Island. And the Army also installed military installations at the outer harbor islands of Great Brewster, Outer Brewster, and Calf Islands. There were several other purposes of the harbor islands. Fort Independence, for example, was part of a secret Navy research project. The Germans had developed a new weapon. It was a magnetic mine. It exploded when a steel-hulled ship passed through its magnetic field. So the Navy organized a group of scientists to work on this project at Castle Island, and they came up with a solution called degaussing, named after the German mathematician Gauss. They neutralized a ship's magnetic field by putting a coil of electric cable around the ship's hull, and the Navy established a degaussing range on Castle Island in January of 1942. Gallup's Island served a military purpose of a different sort. It was the site of the United States Maritime Radio Training School, and they trained over 5,000 men from 1940 to 45. And last summer, when I was working at the Harbor Islands, I got a call from a man in Texas whose father had been stationed there during World War II and wanted a little bit more information about the school. Fort Andrews on Pettus Island was a coastal defense and a training camp, but it also was a prisoner of war camp for Italian soldiers. And one of them was Luigi Di Giorgio, a tank driver who was captured in North Africa in March of 1942, and he spent 30 months at Fort Andrews. And apparently he enjoyed his 30 months at Fort Andrews, because in December of 2001 he returned to Fort Andrews, and there's a really funny article in the Globe about his visit. He fondly recalled days spent at the Charlestown Navy Yard loading munitions on Navy ships headed to the European theater of war. And after a hard day's work, they would head back to Fort Andrews and they would go to the kitchen and make Italian food for their dinner. And through his nephew, who acted as translator, he wrote, "No American soldiers were allowed in the Italian kitchen. First we'd make fun of their cooking, but then we'd let them eat." And there was a special treat for the prisoners who had good behavior. On Sundays, they were allowed to take the ferry to the North End, where host families took them to Mass and fed them an Italian dinner. And after the war ended, about 50 of these POWs actually married young ladies from the North End. Yes, it's very emotional. Love story. With all of this activity in Boston Harbor during World War II, I suppose the question to ask is, so did any enemy vessels actually get into the harbor? Well, it appears that at least one may have. In late June of 1942, the evening operator at the Fort Warren Mine Command Center picked up some sort of disturbance in the outer minefield in the Nantasket roads. The searchlights and the gun batteries at all the harbor forts went into action. They didn't pick up anything suspicious. However, slash marks were discovered on a mine casing, suggesting that a submarine had indeed passed through a newly planted minefield. And we have a picture up here in this display showing the scratched up casing, and you may want to take a look at that. Now, with the end of World War II, that would appear to be the end of our story. After all, the airplane, the amphibious landing techniques, and the new missiles developed during the war pretty much rendered seacoast artillery obsolete. And in fact, in 1950, the United States Army Coast Artillery was abolished. But this was not the end of the story of Boston Harbor's military history. Because once the Soviet Union successfully detonated a nuclear weapon in 1949, it ended the American monopoly on nuclear war, and it inaugurated a new war called the Cold War. And the United States set out to create a new system of weaponry. By the mid-50s, the system was operational. It was called the Nike Missile System, a surface-to-air missile system named after the winged goddess of victory in Greek mythology. What it was a system deploying missiles at fixed sites in a circular pattern at important industrial, government, or transportation centers in the United States. And there were 35 Nike Ajax batteries. That was the first missile developed. And they encircled strategic areas in New England, including several of the harbor islands and harbor communities. There were Nike missile installations at Fort Banks and Heath and Winthrop, at Fort Duval down in Hull, on Long Island, as well as the harbor communities of Quincy, Cohasset, Hingham, and Nahant. Now, most of these Nike installations were withdrawn or dismantled by the late 60s, and that would appear to be the end of our story. And I would have agreed with you until September 11th, 2001. With the events of that day, we've had to once again return to the question of how to defend Boston Harbor. After all, it is a very busy harbor. For those of you, and in this audience, I know I don't have to tell you that. We have container ships and cruise vessels entering and leaving the harbor. We have Logan Airport. We have oil and liquefied natural gas facilities. Boston Harbor is indeed a target of terrorism. But I do think in this latest war, we will not be seeing the return of Fort Warren or Fort Independence or the other forts to military duty. Instead, we will be relying upon the United States Coast Guard, the State Police Marine Patrol, and we will be relying on ourselves as an aware public. You know, shortly after the events of September 11th, the clam diggers at Logan Airport were forbidden to dig there anymore. But most of you probably know they have been reinstated not only as clam diggers, but in a sense they've been deputized as citizen soldiers to be on the alert for anything suspicious, for anything that might be the latest threat to Boston, Massachusetts, and the United States. So I think I have to conclude by saying the full story of the military history of the Boston Harbor Islands remains to be told. Thank you. We'll have to have a lecture next year so I can update you on what's going on. Yes, we certainly will open this up to questions. I will do my best to answer them. I would like to recommend, for a really nice, concise overview of the military history, Gerald Butler's book, The Military History of the Boston Harbor Islands, is a nice introduction. If you're interested in the Nike missile installations, Morgan and Burhau's book, Rings of Supersonic Steel. And I also have a select bibliography. If anybody wants to follow up, I'd certainly be glad to share with you some of those sources. Okay, questions? Yes, we ask if people come to the microphone, if we can.
There is a tower on Nantasket Hill in Hull that is a water tower, and it is sometimes referred to as Fort Revere. And my question is, how does this as a water tower tie in with Fort Revere? Was this at one time an observation post for the Coast Guard?
Fort Revere was a harbor defense. It is actually a water tower. They did have observation posts. Many of the observation posts, actually the change was under the Endicott system, they began changing the types of fire control they used. Before then, fire control was up to the individual person firing the gun. But the improvements made under the Endicott system require the use of optical instruments and mathematical data and the electrical transmission of information from separate observation posts. So these were strung all along the coast from Nahant to the north down to the Fort Revere in Hull. That is not the water tower. The observation posts were often disguised as windmills. Some of them look like cottages. There's pictures in Aubrey Parkman's book, Army Engineers in New England, from 1775 to 1975, and that's an excellent reference, and it'll show all those fire-controlled towers. You can, by the way, visit Fort Revere. There's information on Hull has a website, and there's a couple of other websites. There are also some very good websites on harbor defense. If people are interested in that, I can give you some of the references later. There's a lot of fort freaks out there, as we like to call them. And I mean that with great affection.
I was brought up in Nantasket, and I remember as a kid there was I think an open house at what is now Spinnaker Island.
Yes, Spinnaker Island, right.
And you could visit, and I remember sort of hazy, controlled. I mean, did that control nuclear missiles?
They did. They actually did have part of the Nike program was at Fort Duval in Hull. Yeah. Yeah, and that was actually there. I may be a little bit off on the date. I believe that installation was there as late as 1974. I'd have to double check it. For some reason, that's sticking out in my mind. But it was Fort Duval in Hull. Yeah.
Did they have missiles there as well as that?
Yeah, that was the idea was that any important strategic posts in the United States, whether it was a government center, communication, military, industrial, whatever, would be protected by, they get the rings of supersonic steel because they were arranged in circles. And there are Nike installations all up along the coast. I just mentioned a few of them. There were a lot more.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to make a comment because you mentioned about Hull, and I know that many of the friends of the Boston Harbor Islands have been interested in Fort Revere, and I know that many of you here sitting in this room may not have a car, as I don't, because I live downtown Boston. So the friends of the Harbor Islands in the fall are running not a boat trip to Hull, but a bus trip.
Excellent.
And we will be having a tour with the park ranger out at Fort Revere, which will tie in with all the history there. Then we'll be having lunch down there, and then in the afternoon we're going to the Life Saving Museum, which those of you who were here last week heard all about. So, for heaven's sakes,
Thank you
join
for letting
for
us
the day.
know. Are we going to serve Army-style food, or are we going to really be authentic?
No, you're going to have a nice meal at
even better.
at the Red Parrot.
Excellent, excellent.
I just wanted to ask if you could fill in something that I had heard of. I had heard some friends of mine mention once that there was this great fear during the Spanish-American War that there would be this invasion from Spain of the Boston
Yes,
Harbor.
actually there was a fear that there would be an invasion along the New England coast, and the harbor was in fact mined for that reason. But as it turned out, the United States Navy pretty much decisively defeated the Spanish fleet, and the war was over. It started in April, was over by July. But no, it was indeed a fear. That's why the government of Massachusetts sent the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery to garrison the forts, and that's why Fort Independence returned to active duty as a mine station.
Hi. As a child growing up in Winthrop, we learned that there was an underground tunnel from Winthrop to the outer islands. Is such a thing true?
That is probably true, although I must tell you, as a historian, I have never worked at a historic site that didn't have a tunnel story. But they were. I mean, this is, for ammunition purposes, yes.
Yes, during World War II,
Yes.
We were really worried that somehow or other we might have to use that tunnel. I never really heard whether or not it was so, and you're saying maybe.
The original fear in World War II, most of the harbor defenses were built on the West Coast because, after all, Pearl Harbor was bombed. So the real impetus was to erect fortifications defenses on the West Coast. And after the Battle of Midway, which the United States won, that was kind of the turning point. And after that, the program of harbor defense kind of wasn't so much a priority. But yeah, I mean, there were tunnels.
There were.
But as far as I know, there's not a tunnel under the Paul Revere House. We can refer to Patrick Leahy for that. But that was a favorite story when I worked at the Revere House, that there was a secret tunnel.
Hi, good evening. I'm one of those fort freaks that
All
you
right.
spoke of earlier. And,
Very good.
I'm also the Castle Island Association historian for Fort Independence.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
Your papers from 1984, I have to tell you, are one of our major references for training new tour guides.
Oh, great.
But my question is, you mentioned about the name Fort Warren being transferred to George's Island from what's now Fort Winthrop, or what turned into Fort Winthrop.
Yeah.
And also Fort Strong from Camp Hill in East Boston down to Long Island.
To Long Island, yes.
Did you mention something of those two cases?
I do not know the reason why. I suspect it's in, it might be, I don't know if I sort of skimmed the American State Papers on military affairs. I couldn't find an explanation for why they transfer names. Fort Warren was the original fort on Governor's Island. But when the new fort was built there in 1846, it was named Fort Winthrop after Governor John Winthrop, who had once owned Governor's Island. And Fort Warren was transferred to George's Island, but I have no idea why. Fort Strong was originally a name given to the fortification on Nautle's Island, which is now, of course, East Boston. But then in 1871, it was transferred, or 1867, it was transferred to Long Island when new batteries were built there. And I absolutely do not know why. It will require, it's nothing in the secondary sources about it. I'd like to think that there's some, wonderfully entertaining story, but I'm not sure there is.
And last Sunday, previous to that, they interviewed us at Castle Island, myself and Bill Spain, the president, and Doc Reed, the author of Castle Island.
Whom I know very well, yes.
And they interviewed us for a story that appeared in last Sunday's Globe concerning the Edgar Allan Poe story at Fort Independence. And when they interviewed us, we had some people coming to the fort, even though it was closed, and one of those persons was a gentleman, he's probably in his 40s now, and he said he used to visit the fort when it was closed when he was a youth, and they'd go from the gunpowder magazines through the subterranean tunnels up into the fort. Another tunnel story that never really existed.
Thank you for sharing your tunnel story with us.
As an element of harbor defense, I'm aware that one of the things that has been mentioned by veterans was the existence of an anti-submarine net, and I'm wondering if in your research you've come up with information regarding the anti-submarine net that would have been part of the defense system along with the minefield. To
prevent the entry of enemy torpedo boats or submarines, a net, do we have a picture up? We don't have, actually, I have a picture I can show you. It was stretched from Pettix Island across Hull Gut to prevent the entry of ships. I have a picture here if people want to see it. I think I have it in my briefcase showing the naval net, yes. Naval nets and obstructions, by the way, were used for centuries before then. In the 18th century, they had different kinds of chains, and there's a French term for it which escapes me, chevaux de frise. They're pointed sticks, I believe, and that was used in the 18th century.
Just first comment is the Italian soldiers were also quartered on Wood Island in East Boston, and I remember the old Italian ladies bringing them food and passing it through the fence to them.
Yes.
I don't know if any marriages resulted.
I'm sure there were some.
But my question was, we used to go picnicking in the Hunt, and we go up, the first time we went up and climbed up on this hill, and there's overgrown with grass and wild grapes, and there's a chimney sticking up through the top. Couldn't imagine what the heck it was. And we walked over to the edge and we looked over. There's metal door. There were metal doors. There were bunkers.
Yes.
Built right into the side of the hill. A couple of them. I wonder if there were guns. Were there guns
there was the East Point Reservation, and then there was, which was actually property owned by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the United States Senator from Massachusetts, and also Fort Ruckman. There's pictures in Mr. Butler's book. You can see pictures. Nahant was a very important military base because it guards the northern flank, so to speak, of Boston Harbor. So there was a lot of military activity going on in Nahant.
And there were guns there then.
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's very hard to find guns, though, before World War II because most of the earlier guns were melted down for the war effort in World War II. Okay, I think, was that the last question? Okay, well, thank you for your questions.